boxing truth here. I had to talk about this because there was an interesting argument on a podcast that I always listen to. And it was writer Steve Kim and former writer, who's now an actor, Gabriel Montoya, arguing about Triple G. And whether Sergio Martinez Maravilla ducked him during his reign as middleweight champion. Now, both had strong opinions on the matter, and I had to side with Gabriel Montoya because he was being unbiased about it. He had better points, in my opinion, than Steve Kim. And I had to agree with side with Montoya when it comes to the situation because, honestly, Sergio Martinez did not duck Gennady Golovkin. It's unfair to say to Maravilla to say he ducked him when Golovkin was never in position to fight Maravilla. He was never a mandatory to Maravilla's belt, and he was nowhere near the star that he is today, Golovkin is, compared to when Maravilla retired from the sport back in 2014. Now, Maravilla is greatly underappreciated. He probably will end up in the Hall of Fame based on his credentials, based on his upbringing in the sport, taking the sport up late, getting sacrificed against Antonio Margarito very early in his career, who was very green at the time and not as experienced as Margarito, ended up getting stopped, but was able to climb back up the rankings, win a world title in junior middleweight, and finally get his opportunity very late in his career at 35 years of age, 34 years of age at the time, against Paul Williams on HBO. And there's been plenty of fighters that have ducked Golovkin. Felix Sturm ducked him because Golovkin was his mandatory for a long time. Miguel Cotto ducked him because Golovkin was his mandatory for over a year. Was even given paid step-aside money in order to allow Cotto voluntary defenses. Now, the one with Canelo is obviously understandable because of the money generated from that bout. And then Canelo also ducked Golovkin by vacating the belt, since Golovkin was the mandatory to his strap. But Golovkin was never the mandatory to Sergio Martinez. He was never in position to fight Maravilla. He was nowhere near the big money fight that he could have been now had Maravilla was still fighting at this day and age compared to when Maravilla was reigning as the middleweight champion. And it has to do with the timeline. It has to do with the fact that by the time Golovkin first fought on HBO in the United States, it was September of 2012, which was pretty much at the tail end of Maravilla's career. By that time, Maravilla finally got his big pay-per-view fight as the B-side to Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., who Jr., Bob Arum, and Freddie Roach, they avoided Maravilla as long as they could. They waited to make that fight, as Maravilla was always in position, was in line as the mandatory to fight Chavez Jr., since Maravilla was wrongfully stripped of that belt because of politics and because of the networks, or HBO in this case. They wouldn't approve a certain opponents, and in the case of Maravilla, they wouldn't approve his mandatory when he was a WBC champion against Sebastian Zivic. They wouldn't approve of him as the opponent. He was willing to make that mandatory defense, but HBO said no, and the WBC, they followed their rules in this case and put Maravilla as champion emeritus. Pretty much put him in as kind of similar to champion in recess, where he'll get first dibs at the guys who was next in line for the WBC, which was Chavez Jr. and Sebastian Zivic. And ironically, HBO approved that fight between Chavez Jr. and Sebastian Zivic, even though they turned it down for Maravilla. And of course, Chavez Jr. had more promotional ties. He had Bob Arum backing him at the time, and Bob Arum had a lot of leverage with HBO at that time, since Arum and HBO were going through the issues when Manny Pacquiao left HBO for Showtime for one fight. But it's fucked up what happened to Maravilla. He was mistreated by the sanctioning bodies. He became a unified middleweight champion and lineal champion at middleweight back in 2010 when he defeated Kelly Pavlik, and was already stripped after 10 days after winning the WBO and WBC belts of his WBO strap. And the belt was then put up for grabs between Danny Jacobs and Dmitry Pirog, and we all know what happened in that fight. Jacobs got knocked the fuck out, and the hardware ended up going to Pirog. Didn't work out for Golden Boy in that situation. And then Maravilla gets stripped of his WBC title because HBO wouldn't approve of his mandatory opponent. And if you look at Maravilla's reign, it's pretty impressive. I mean, he fought the best available guys. He fought a lot of undefeated guys, like Sinzuric. He was undefeated, 37-0, coming with a lot of momentum going into the fight. Was very sharp, and Maravilla just schooled him, destroyed him, stopped him in 8 rounds. He fought Matthew Macklin when he had a lot of momentum coming into the fight. He knocked out Paul Williams in a rematch, shockingly. Made a lot of believers out of everybody with that performance. Beat Kelly Pavlik. I think he beat... Did he fight Darren Barker? I'm not even sure. I think he did. And I think he was undefeated at the time. I'm doing it by the dome, so my bad. I'm not looking at anything. But he fought worthy contenders. He fought guys that came in with a lot of momentum. Fought a lot of undefeated fighters. And was mistreated by the sanctioning bodies because he didn't have the strong promotional ties backing him. He had Lou DiBella, who's not a major player in the game. He's pretty much a puppet nowadays for Al Heyman. I mean, he still has his own shows. He still assigns a few fighters, but he doesn't have the leverage or the power compared to the other power brokers in boxing. Especially not at that time. Especially not even now. He's never had that type of power. And Maravilla, he just continued to defend the lineal strap, fight the best available guys, and was trying to pursue those money fights that he needed, that he wanted in order to close out his career. He wanted that Chavez Jr. fight because that was the big fight there. Much bigger than a Golovkin fight. He decided to take the Miguel Cotto fight because that was the biggest fight out there available. That was his money fight. Another pay-per-view fight as the B-side. And he was heavily favored in the bout despite being pretty much not the same fighter, just a shell of himself. The fight with Chavez Jr. ruined him. Even though he dominated, he won the battle but lost the war. He was never the same after that fight. That was his last hurrah. He never looked that good ever again after that fight. Came back too soon against Martin Murray. Ended up injuring his knee again. And didn't fight for over a year. And there was rumors before the Cotto fight that he didn't even spar a single round in preparation for that fight. And when you watch the fight, it seems evident that he didn't do much sparring or any sparring because he had no punch resistance. The very first big shot he got hit with, he got rocked and he got hurt and he got dropped. It was pretty shocking because a lot of people were picking Maravilla. I picked Maravilla to beat Cotto. Thought he was going to win that fight handily, but I had no idea how bad a shape he was in prior to that fight, how much the knee surgery affected him, his mobility, and that he just pretty much couldn't train as properly as he wanted to for the Miguel Cotto fight, which ended his career. He never fought again. But it's unfair to say that he ducked Golovkin, because honestly he never did. Golovkin was never in position to fight him. Golovkin was just beginning to build his brand by the time Maravilla was at the twilight of his career. His first fight was on HBO September 2012. Maravilla only fought 2 more times after that date. A fight against Martin Murray, who was considered just last year the best opponent Triple G fought on American airwaves. Matthew Macklin as well. I mean, Golovkin fought Maravilla's leftovers and knocked those guys out in spectacular fashion, while Maravilla had a life and death struggle with Martin Murray. And some people argued that Martin Murray won that fight, but I thought Maravilla pulled it out. He pulled it out in the last round. He dug deep like the champion he was, even though he was nowhere near the level or in condition that he was prior to the Chavez Jr. fight. And I just wanted to put my 2 cents into this story that it's not very accurate. I mean, it's really. I mean, you can say that you could try to argue, you can have an opinion, but I just don't see how you could say Maravilla ducked Golovkin, because he didn't provide the biggest money fight out there for him. He was never the mandatory to his belt. He was still not even $1 million fighter by the time Maravilla was pretty much ending his career. Golovkin's star was rising around the middle of 2014 when he finally was able to get a fight in the big room at Madison Square Garden against Daniel Gill, but it was nowhere near a sellout. He was still building up his fan base, his brand at the time. But Maravilla didn't duck anybody. He fought the toughest guys out there. He fought Paul Williams at a time when he was one of the most avoided fighters out there. Not many were willing to fight that guy, especially since he didn't really provide big money for you to fight him, but Maravilla did. If Golovkin was the mandatory, or was in position, or if he was able to give the type of reward that Cotto and Chavez Jr. gave him to fight him, I'm pretty damn sure Maravilla would have fought him. He would have honored the mandatory defense. He wouldn't have ducked Golovkin. He didn't duck him then, since Golovkin was never in position, didn't have the star power or provided the type of payday that Maravilla could have gotten compared to a Cotto or a Chavez Jr. It was just never meant to be. Maravilla was going through his issues with his injuries, inactivity, and Golovkin was slowly but surely becoming a superstar in the sport. It's too bad that fight never happened. It would have been a really damn interesting, good fight. But in my opinion, Maravilla didn't duck Gennady Golovkin. This is Boxing Truth. I'm out.